Happy Father's Day. I'll be honest, I'm a little conflicted about Father's Day. So growing up, my original birth home was a little bit challenging. My relationship with my birth father was a little challenging. Then when I moved in with my aunt and uncle, my uncle and I are both very, very strong-headed, opinionated, and also brilliant and good-looking men. So let's make sure when he watches this video, he knows I didn't throw him, right, Anthony? I didn't throw my uncle under the bus. He's awesome. But it really didn't strike me what fatherhood meant until I became one, until I became a dad. And then learning how to be the man that children look up to has been a real challenge for me. So for all of you dads who are here this morning, we're going to recognize you at the end of service. But I just want to say thank you so much for all that you do that nobody ever sees, because being a dad is being a hero. So can we just give all of our dads a round of applause? So there's really no good way to transition from dad to 10 Commandments, so we're just going to hard shift, right? Today we're going to continue our teaching series on the 10 Commandments. Now let me give you the key thought that sort of wraps all these together, and here it is. The 10 Commandments are the life rules for God's people. Each reveals an area of life that we are to give to Him. And as we've been going through the 10 Commandments, I've been reminding you that there's a difference between ancient law codes and modern law codes. Ancient law codes told you what to aspire to, whereas most modern law codes only tell you what not to do. So as we approach the 10 Commandments, in our modern day understanding, it's real easy to just read them and go, oh, I shouldn't do that, I shouldn't do that. And as long as I don't do something, I must be okay. But for that to be true, that means if you sat in a chair all day long and did nothing and said nothing and thought nothing and accomplished nothing, that you would be totally righteous. You see the problem with that logic. You cannot define righteousness by the absence of activity, although you can absolutely define unrighteousness by doing unrighteous stuff. So we've got to not only look at what it says not to do by implication, what does the no mean as the yes? What is the inverse of that? Now, a couple basics as we approach the 10 Commandments. Number one, that they are life rules for His people given on their way out of Egypt. Number two, they divide into two categories. The first 4 commandments define man's relationship with God. That's the vertical relationship. The latter 6, which is where we're at now, they are all about man's relationship to man. They were given to direct a life of faith for a nation, not a person. And I would say for today's commandment, that's going to be really important for you to keep in your mind, because when we read today's commandment, it's going to feel very personal. It's going to feel very, Jim, don't do that. Bob, don't do that. Rob, don't do that. But you've got to remember the story. God redeemed His entire nation from Egypt through the story of the Exodus. They crossed the Red Sea. The Red Sea closes behind them, and they are at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God speaks audibly to the entire nation and gives them these commandments. That's super important for your context. Now, let's go ahead and look at today's verse. We're in Exodus chapter 20, verse 15. Exodus is pretty easy. It's the second book of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, chapter 20 comes right after chapter 19. And verse 15, here's what it says. You shall not. Please, somebody said pass, right? So there's at least one geek in the room who said, you shall not pass. Sorry. You shall not steal. You shall not steal. Now, again, if we're being hyper literal, just like no murder, just like no adultery, hyper literal in the Hebrew, you shall not steal is no steals. That's all it means. No steal. So I only get really the 2 words. Now, as a crime, we don't usually refer to it as stealing. We refer to it as theft. No thieving. No thieving allowed. But remember that God is speaking to a nation, not to an individual. And probably for this one, just like the no murder, the no adultery, we've got to see what is the implication here. Well, if God is speaking to a nation and not a person, then this commandment accomplishes 2 things in the positive for the nation of Israel. Number one, it establishes a right to ownership. This commandment, do not steal, establishes the individual right to ownership. Now, how did I get there? because to me it's a simple logical conclusion. If nobody owns nothing, nobody can steal nothing. You can only steal if it rightfully belongs to someone else first. If it's all free for the grabsies, then it's not stealing. And this is important because there are some who would accuse the Old Testament nation of Israel of being communal living, where everyone shared everything in kind. In fact, there are some cult leaders who tried to use the Old Testament communal living to establish that today. I'm not going to use any names, but those of you who are nodding your heads, who probably watch as many murder and crime documentaries as my family does, you're probably feeling me, right? So I need you to understand that Old Testament Israel is not a 100% communal community. And how do I know that? Because if you didn't own something, then there's no way to steal something. So the first thing that this commandment does is it establishes the right of ownership for every individual in the nation. That's also why it was important to remember the context. God is at Sinai speaking verbally to the entire nation that he just redeemed, and he is installing in this one phrase the right for each and every family, each and every individual to have ownership. The second thing it does, which is sort of a derivative of the first one, is it installs ownership for the entire nation as a foundational principle that is protected by the law itself. Because again, if Kim doesn't own it, then that means Sharita can take it and it's not stealing. But if Kim owns it and Sharita breaks in and steals it, then it's a crime. So not only does it create this idea and property ownership, it installs it as a right of law. You are not allowed to take the stuffs or the people. And I'm going to get to this in a minute. This word here in Hebrew doesn't just mean theft of property. It also includes everything. Your animals, your children, your grandchildren. Because keep in mind, at the time that this is being received by the nation of Israel, they do not live in the kind of nation that you and I live in today. They are much largely a nomadic people. They have their tents, they set them up, they have their individual family clans, and within that family clan there are family members, there are flocks, there are herds, there is land, people are farming, so we're very much in an agrarian society. So this word to steal or to take involves everything within your individual households. So it establishes the right of ownership and it codifies it in law. Each family has the right to have their property protected by law. Now, that may seem like a duh principle to us, right? We live in a nation where people have rights, right? We live in a nation where there's a whole group of rights that are protected by law. But do me a favor and just take your American civics class, put it to the side for a second. I want you to be the children of Israel coming out of 400 years of slavery in Egypt, where the only thing that you had the rights to do was to work and to die. Your very children were owned by Egypt. They had the right to try to kill the sons of Egypt because they were afraid of Egypt. So when I say that this commandment installs the right to ownership protected by law, Dan, this is a big change. This is a monumental change for a group of persons who for 400 years have lived as slaves of another nation with no rights to autonomy, no rights to ownership, no rights to family protection. This is like a hashtag big deal kind of thing. We have been blessed to be born into a nation where we have rights already codified into law. Imagine what it would be like if there was no Bill of Rights. Imagine what it would be like if there were no U.S. Constitution. Imagine what it would be like, ladies, if you're considered part of the property of your family and not individuals who have their own autonomous rights. That's the society we're in. That's where we're at. We're not in your and mine society today. Like, she's not in here, but I'll go ahead and pick on my youngest daughter. We were having a conversation, and how many parents have to remind their kids to clean their room? Is it just me? Okay, like just checking. I just want to make sure, like Jen, that my family's kind of normal. I get that Jim's going to say I'm not normal. That's fine. I accept. But we were having a conversation with my youngest daughter about why she should clean her room. And she said to my wife and I, she said, I don't understand why I have to clean my room. It's my room. Can't I make the decision? To which my wife doesn't miss a beat. And she goes, Princess, you got it wrong. She goes, that's my room. I issued it to you. It's still in my house. Right? Mama Bear don't play. But when you think about it, that's exactly the way we as Americans think. Well, it's mine. You can't tell me what to do with it. It's my phone. You can't tell me what apps to download, right? It's my phone. You can't tell me who to text. Princess, if I pay the bill, I could do what I want with that phone and turn it off. You and I are very used to this law. And that's why I'm trying to make a big point of it here, is because you need to understand they didn't have this until this moment. This moment, all of a sudden, all the things that were yours were protected. You're allowed to have them. You're allowed to grow and to prosper and have your family and your possessions and your home protected by the law of God. This is a major change societally for where they are. It just happens to be very similar to where you and I already live. If you break into my car and take something, I'm already used to the idea that you're not allowed to do that. But if you and I were in the original group of people who walked out of Egypt, Sharita, this is a big deal. I can't just come and take your stuff because I'm bigger or I'm stronger or I'm older. No. You have the right to these things. So now if I'm trying to put this into a contemporary context, what does this mean? It means that ownership and accountability are foundational to God's people. Ownership and the accountability of ownership are foundational to being part of the community of God. The New Testament has a word for this. It's called stewardship. The New Testament has a word for being accountable for that which is yours. We call it stewardship. God has put certain things in your life. You're responsible for how you deal with those things, and that is called stewardship. Now, stealing or theft in the Old Testament law has three basic types. So there's three different ways that you could violate this commandment. The first is taking something or someone belonging to another person. You can take something or you can take someone who belongs to another person. Now, in our modern day society, we don't view taking something and taking someone as the same crime, right? The first one is called theft. The second one's called kidnapping. Yep. Here in this law, same thing. There's no distinction between stealing a thing that belongs to someone and stealing a human that belongs to someone. This commandment encompasses all of those things. So first would be taking something or someone belonging to another. The second way that this commandment can be violated is being in possession of something or someone belonging to someone else. Let's see, who am I going to pick on today? Mike, I love you. You're sitting right there. You get picked on. So Mike is a thief, just in case anybody didn't know that. For my example, not in real life, but for my example, Mike is a thief. Mike steals from Bob. Mike breaks into Bob's tent while Dottie's asleep, and he steals something from Bob. But Mike is smart enough to fence it before he gets caught. So Mike steals Bob's stuff, and he fences it to Rob. Because Rob knows that Hannah is super jealous of Dottie's necklace, and so Rob buys the stolen property from Mike, and he fences it over to Rob, and then Rob gives it to Hannah. You following me? Hannah has broken this commandment because she is in possession of an item that was stolen from someone else. If you continue to read in the Old Testament law, it's not just the actual act of theft, but it is being found in possession of an item or a person belonging to someone else is equally a violation of this commandment. Now, interestingly, the law doesn't really necessarily say if Rob broke the commandment because he's not found to be in possession of it, which is really kind of an interesting Old Testament loophole. So, Rob, if you're going to fence stuff, make sure you give it to your wife first. That's your takeaway for today. All right. So number one, taking something belonging to another. Number two, being in possession of something or someone belonging to another. And the third way that you can violate this commandment is being the cause of another's loss of a thing or a person. If you are the cause of the loss from someone else's persons or belongings. So what does this look like? There is a verse, and I don't know if I've included it in my notes, but I'll tell you about it because I found it while I was studying. So let's say while Mike is stealing from Bob and fencing it over there to Rob, Dan is out on the back 40 of his property, and he is taking his flock out for its daily lunch bunch. So he's taking out his flock, but Dan's property happens to back up to Jim and Lisa's property. And Dan's property is just a little light on the grass today. So Dan looks around, and he sees that Jim and Lisa, their whole family, they're out doing something else, right? They're inside, they're making some new hummus, they're making something. So he just crosses the property line, and he allows his flock to graze on Jim and Lisa's land. That is a violation of this commandment. Now, does that mean that Dan actually ate? No. But Dan, you could have. Bro, if you were really hungry, you need to munch on some grass while you're out there with your sheep, nobody's going to judge. But what I need you to see is, even if Dan willingly violates the property line, and he takes his flock, and he feeds his flock on his neighbor's land, Dan is guilty of violating this commandment because Dan's actions are the direct cause of Jim and Lisa's loss of what grew on their land. It is still, that's why I had to word it this way, being the cause of another's loss of something or someone. If Dan feeds his flock on Jim and Lisa's land, his sheep are quite literally stealing or taking away the provision that Jim and Lisa grew on their back 40. And then Dan conveniently brings his flock back over the property line before Jim and Lisa are done baking, and no one is the wiser. And then Jim and Lisa just wonder why the whole back quarter acre has already been eaten. That's still a violation of this commandment. I had to go through all of that so that you could see you're not holy just because you didn't physically steal from someone else. If you're found in possession of someone else's things, that's a violation of this commandment. Or if you are the causal factor in someone else's loss, that is also a violation. So with all of that, here's the best biblical definition of theft that I can give you. Stealing is any act, intentional or accidental, which causes a loss to someone else's property, provision, or family. This covers physical theft, kidnapping, dishonest gain, and accidental loss. If you're looking for more details, those of you who like to study, look to Exodus chapter 22. I'm going to give you a couple examples from Scripture of ways that you can violate this commandment. Exodus 22. Stealing cattle from a neighbor, stealing sheep, goats, anything, required 2 times, 4 times, or 5 times the amount payment. That's Exodus 22, verse 1. Being sold as a servant to repay a debt because you stole and you couldn't get it back. So Mike steals from Bob, fences to Rob. Hannah's found out having it. Mike and Hannah, neither one of them can pay Bob and Dottie back. They both have to serve Bob and Dottie as servants until they've earned enough money to pay themselves out of debt. That's Exodus 22, verse 3. Grazing your animal on someone else's field, Exodus 22, 5. Starting a fire that destroys someone else's property is a violation of this commandment. So you're out there, you're burning, you're having some fire time. We do that in the fall. You're having some backyard burn time, and all of a sudden, your fire gets a little bit bigger than you can manage. It goes over, it burns down your neighbor's shed. That is a violation of this commandment because you're the cause of the loss of someone else's stuff. That's Exodus 22, verse 6. Paying restitution for items that you were securing for someone else. Rob's going to have to pay Bob back because he was trying to fence the stolen goods from Mike. So he has to pay restitution. That's 22 verse 7. And paying restitution for injury to a borrowed animal. Now this is one that we don't think about, but how about I do it this way? If I were to borrow, Dave McDonough, what car do you drive? You drive a Lincoln. Can I borrow it after church? If I damage it while it is in my possession, I take out your nice Lincoln, I go for a Father's Day drive, I get on 95, I get up to like 100 and something miles an hour, and I clip somebody and I damage your car. Is it okay to return it damaged without making it better? No, it's not. Now it makes a lot more sense, right? In a modern day, or in an ancient agrarian society, if you were to borrow someone's animal that they used to feed their family, and that animal got injured or killed while it was in your possession, that's a violation of this commandment. In the same way, if I borrow Dave's Lincoln and I joyride with it, and I wreck it, or I scratch it, or I in any way make it no longer the way it was when I borrowed it, I should be on the hook to fix it and put it back to the standard in which it was given to me. That's Exodus chapter 22, verse 14. So you see how this commandment is a whole lot bigger than just keep your hands out of somebody else's pocketbook, right? So what is this commandment protecting? Again, let me give you the definition. Stealing is any act, intentional or accidental, which causes a loss to someone else's property, provision, or family. The purpose of this commandment was to build a healthy society in which all people had the right to property ownership and the responsibility to ensure that everyone else's property was protected. That's why you have to remember talking to a nation, not a person. This is not just, by the way, Pete, don't take any of Bob's stuff, right? That would be the individual perspective. When you see it in a national light, what does it mean? It means that the people of God who have been denied the opportunity to be autonomous and to have protections, now not only have autonomy, have protection, have accountability for stewardship, but the entire community was responsible to protect the belongings of everyone else. This is a communal commandment that says, no, you're not allowed to steal Dottie's necklace just because Hannah likes it. No, you're not allowed to graze your sheep on somebody else's land just because their grass tastes better than your grass. No, I'm not allowed to joyride in Dave's Lincoln and damage it. Right? And damage it. This is a national protection for something that God's people have been denied for centuries. This is not just, by the way, don't pickpocket, or don't, shoplift, or don't steal when you're at your neighbor's house. There's a much bigger thing at play. So what does this look like today? What does this look like today? Well, in my first example of borrowing Dave's Lincoln, I would say that borrowing anything and damaging it while it is in your possession and not making restitution. Borrowing something, damaging it while it is in your possession, and not making restitution is a violation of this commandment. Using any form of bootleg software, illegally downloading music, movies, etc., is a violation of this commandment. Why? Because you are stealing the intellectual property that is owned by someone else. Right? Anybody ever notice when you go to the movies that little screen that shows up for a second? Piracy is not a victimless crime. Right? There's an entire strike right now in Hollywood by the writers' union. Why? Because the writers still retain the intellectual property rights for the things they create. So they're still fighting about who gets to own stuff. So bootleg software, music, movies, etc. Taking anything that you don't pay for that is supposed to be paid for. Taking anything you don't pay for that should be paid for. I think that's somewhat the obvious one. So I'm just going to let that one slide. If that one's you, please be convicted. How about this one? Sharing passwords for streaming services without permission. Right? Netflix is coming after y'all, man. Come on, man. Right? But do you realize, corporate Netflix is changing their entire paradigm because so many people do this that it's normative. Right? So many people, I just paid for that. Here, let me give you that password. I just paid for that. Here, let me give you that password. If you are using something that you are not paying for, you are stealing from someone else. Just let that one sit there for a minute. How about this? Fundraising, but keeping some of the money for yourself. Fundraising for a good cause, that's fantastic. Fundraise, please. But when you don't tell anybody that you're taking 20% off the top for yourself, because I'm actively spending my time fundraising, you are taking from someone else, taking something that doesn't belong to you. And my absolute fave, Donna, this is the one that you're going to amen. You ready? Copying church curriculum that says do not duplicate just because it's for the church. That drives me nuts. I have worked in church for 20 years. I have seen tons of people take something that specifically says, do not duplicate, and go, bless him, it's for Jesus, he understands. You are stealing the intellectual property rights from whoever created that curriculum or that small group study or that book or whatever it is. Don't use the church copier to steal church stuff. Maybe that's just a thing for me and Donna, right? Donna, that's a point for us. But anytime you take something or duplicate something that says do not duplicate, do not copy. I mean, and I have to tell you, this is probably, of all the commandments, this is the one I have broken the most in my life. Growing up as a geek, growing up as somebody who could build computers, I at one point had gigabytes worth of gigabytes of illegally obtained property. I was really good, right? Maybe me and Matt. Matt, that was for you and me, right? Come on. Geeks, we were there, bro. I had whole hard drives of stuff that was stolen. Probably hundreds of gigabytes of music, movies, illegally downloaded software. I had software programs just to break the lock on regular programs. Like, trust me, been there, done that. And there was a point that I had to admit, this is just as much theft as if I broke in and stole from your house. We don't think about it that way because it's digital, or because it's intellectual, or because nobody sees it, so therefore it didn't happen, right? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. This commandment is way deeper than those things. When you do not respect the autonomy and ownership of your fellow citizens, you're violating this commandment. Now, we've grown up with the right to own. We've grown up in a nation where we have protected rights, and it's a glorious, wonderful thing. But I need you to wake up and realize there are nations today that don't have these rights. There are people today who have their daughters stolen by warring tribes so they have more slaves. That happens today in our culture. Not in America, although I will say, I don't remember if it's now, but that human trafficking, it's surpassed the illegal drug trade, and it's about to surpass the illegal arms trade as the number one most trafficked item in the world is human beings. That's today. That's not ancient Egypt. That's not ancient Persia. That's not ancient Rome. That's today here in America. Do you know, and I just know this because Pastor Paul and I, we talked about it one day in the office. Do you know the number one day every year where the most humans are trafficked in and out of a single location? Does anybody know what it is? Super Bowl Sunday. More young women will be trafficked in and out of wherever the Super Bowl is being held on the planet on that one day than anywhere else in the world. Because the number of people who spend money for those super big, expensive box seats also spend money for super expensive hotel suites and buy human beings. That happens today. The idea that we don't need to protect not only the autonomy to own, but to protect the autonomy of human life. That's still a super important value for us today. We just have to remember that just because we've been born in a culture where you and I have grown up with these things are mine and these things aren't yours, you can't take my things until somebody bigger than you just takes them. And then all of a sudden we go, why is that wrong? Well, if you don't have a law that says that's morally evil, then you have no right to say it's wrong. You have no right to appeal to it. As the nation of Israel came out of Egypt, they had to reestablish society. They had to reestablish what is important. And one of God's top 10 things, don't take other people's people. Bad. It literally just says, no taking, no stealing, no theft. Don't kidnap. Don't take your neighbor's daughter. Don't take your neighbor's cousin. Don't take your neighbor's ox. Stop stealing Dottie's necklace. I think a lot of times we let ourselves oversimplify the scriptures to the point that we feel like, oh, I'm good at that. You know, I haven't pickpocketed anybody. I haven't stolen anything from a store since like middle school. I actually did used to shoplift all the time. Like totally admit it. I shoplifted the mess out of stuff when I was 6th grade, 7th grade, and I was just really good at it. I don't know why. I have no idea why. That was something I just decided to do. But anytime I wanted to like just give a gift to some cute girl that I found, I just walk in the store, steal it, take the tag off, and give it to her. Like, I was really good at it. And then all of a sudden I had to realize, hey, that's probably not a good thing. Like a lot of times people look at the pastor and they're like, oh, he's so holy. He must have grown up in a monastery. No, I grew up with Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer. That was my life. So let me give you a takeaway. Let me bring this in for landing. How do we live out do not steal today? So here's your takeaway. The prohibition against stealing reminds us to be good stewards while protecting the individual ownership and family of others. If you do any action, whether it is accidental or intentional, remember the fire, right? If you accidentally are burning in your backyard and you burn down your neighbor's stuff, you might not have intentionally set it like arson. Guess what? You're still on the hook to make restitution. If you perform any action which violates the autonomous ownership of any other person or corporation, you have violated this commandment. It's a lot bigger than just stealing or just whatever.